7 years ago, a 17-year-old boy vanished from his family home in Sedona, Arizona, in the pre-dawn hours, slipping from a room that should have been a sanctuary. The sky had not yet lightened, and the air carried the dry, crisp chill of early March. At first, police entertained the possibility that Kevin Freeman had wandered off, perhaps distracted by an early morning hike or the call of the Red Rock Trails. But his mother, steadfast and intuitive, never believed that her son would leave without notice. A quiet alarm had long burned within her, a sense that something unseen was closing in on the edges of their normal life. From that night forward, time stretched in two directions: the immediate shock of Kevin's disappearance, and the slow, grinding passage of years during which every clue seemed to evaporate. 7 years would pass before a routine bureaucratic process, a submission of fingerprints for reasons long forgotten, would collide with a trace preserved from that very night. That intersection would turn what had become a faint, lingering ache into a revelation capable of reopening the past. Before that night, Kevin's life had the texture of quiet stability, shaped by routine and a deep fascination with the landscape surrounding Sedona. He rose before dawn to prepare for school, slipping on worn sneakers and gathering his geology notebook and field guide. His bedroom, on the second floor of a modest brick home, smelled faintly of pine from the Arizona forests and the earthy scent of textbooks long opened and closed in careful study. Posters of desert formations and hiking maps lined the walls, a testament to his curiosity and his measured independence. Kevin's days were a balance of academic rigor and physical activity, climbing trails or collecting samples, yet always returning to the ordered rhythm of home life: shared breakfasts, the hum of the stove, laughter exchanged over cereal and toast. Before the family dispersed to school, work, and daily errands, he had a quiet confidence that drew respect rather than attention, a reliability that made him the sort of teenager parents trusted to check in when he returned from the trails. His friends admired his discipline and curiosity, and his teachers spoke of a young man whose focus seemed almost monastic, yet never at the expense of kindness or humor. In those days, Sedona itself was a canvas of reds and oranges, of narrow streets that carried the echo of footsteps and the scent of desert sage carried on the morning wind. Yet, underneath this surface of normalcy, there were subtle vulnerabilities. Windows left slightly ajar in the night, a back door that sometimes rattled in the wind, paths through the nearby woods that Kevin knew intimately. Anyone observing could see predictable patterns. It was a home and a life shaped by routine and trust. But those very qualities that made it safe also made it knowable, susceptible to intrusion. That night, when the pre-dawn hush settled over the house and the lightest movements cast the longest shadows, the world Kevin had trusted shifted imperceptibly. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Kevin Freeman's home life in Sedona was the kind that seemed immune to sudden fractures. His parents, attentive, yet quietly efficient, maintained the rhythm of the household with practiced ease. Mornings began with the smell of brewed coffee and the sizzle of eggs, the faint hum of the refrigerator blending with the distant song of desert birds. Kevin's younger sister moved through the house with the sleepy inertia of early adolescence, brushing past him as he packed his school bag with notebooks, field guides, and a small magnifying glass he often carried on geology trips. Even the family dog, a golden retriever named Rusty, followed predictable routes from rug to doorway, padding silently beside them in the kitchen. After breakfast, Kevin would leave the house on foot or with a parent, walking past the sandstone formations that framed their quiet neighborhood. He had established a network of trails he explored with care, familiar with every outcropping and wash, noting the geological features with an obsessive precision that reflected his studious nature. School was a predictable anchor: teachers, friends, the rhythm of assignments and lab experiments. Yet, Evenings were equally structured, returning home for homework, dinner, and the occasional television show. His mother would often linger in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes marking the passage of minutes, while Kevin's father checked emails and bills in the living room. A routine of subtle domestic security. Kevin had one bond that stood out, a deep connection with his older cousin, Marcus, who shared his fascination with geology. On weekends, Marcus and Kevin would hike nearby canyons, exchanging observations and theories about rock formations, fossils, and erosion patterns. That relationship was a lifeline of camaraderie and guidance, grounding Kevin's curiosity and giving him a confidant within his own family circle. This connection would later resonate profoundly when fragments of Kevin's past resurfaced after years of absence. Peripheral adults moved through the home and neighborhood unnoticed in the patterns of daily life. The mail carrier waved politely on her rounds. The occasional repairman entered the house to fix the leaky faucet, and neighbors strolled along familiar streets, greeting one another with casual nods. None of these figures raised alarm. They were part of the background of a life that seemed predictable, safe, and orderly. Yet, these same individuals, merely observers of routine, unknowingly mapped Kevin's habits, what time he left for school, the routes he preferred, the windows he sometimes left unlocked, and the times the house would be quiet before dinner dawn as the evening approached on that fateful day. Kevin's home hummed with the mundane sounds of domestic life. Rusty lay on the rug near the front door, the sun casting long shadows across the floorboards. Plates were cleared, homework folders stacked neatly on desks, and the air smelled faintly of detergent and toasted bread. Lights flickered on one by one as the family moved through their evening ritual showers, brushing teeth. Quiet chatter each moment, underscoring the sense of normalcy that would soon be shattered. Outside, the desert wind whispered against the red rocks, brushing loose sand across the quiet streets. The paths Kevin had walked countless times during the day seemed almost to hold their breath, anticipating a night that would leave the household fractured. Every predictable routine, every familiar sight and sound, reinforced a false sense of security, a security that would be violently disrupted, leaving only a memory of what once was. The final day of Kevin Freeman's life before disappearance began like any other in March 2014, at 6:30 a.m. Sunlight spilled over Sedona's sandstone cliffs, gilding the neighborhood in amber. Kevin rose, methodical and precise, packing his geology notebooks, water bottle, and a small field compass. Breakfast was quiet but familiar: scrambled eggs, toast, and the comforting hum of the morning routine. By 7:15 a.m., he had kissed his mother on the cheek, exchanged a nod with his sister, and walked out the front door, backpack slung securely over one shoulder, heading toward the small canyon trails just beyond their street. School hours passed without incident. Teachers noted Kevin's attentiveness, peers exchanged greetings, and he completed assignments with the focus that had become his hallmark. After classes, he lingered briefly with Marcus, his cousin, near the school's science lab, discussing sedimentary layers and fossil placements. By 3:45 p.m., Kevin was home, taking the familiar back alley path to avoid traffic, Rusty bounding to meet him as he rounded the corner. Afternoon homework, a shower, and a snack marked the passage of late afternoon into early evening. The house smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and warm bread from dinner preparations, the shadows lengthening across familiar floors. Evening settled into the household as Kevin's parents checked schedules for the following day, and his sister organized school supplies for tomorrow. At 8:15 p.m., Kevin went to his room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The night air carried the faint hum of distant traffic, occasional owl calls from the nearby canyon, and the subtle creak of the old floorboards as Rusty wandered from room to room. The lights in the house were dimmed, each room glowing with the soft warmth of lamps. creating pockets of security within walls that had always felt safe. Sometime after 9 p.m., Kevin's mother awoke briefly, half lingering between sleep and wakefulness. A subtle impression caught her attention, a shadow shifting near his bedroom doorway, a faint outline against the dim light, as if someone were bending over the bed. Her heart quickened, but her rational mind dismissed it as a dream or the trick of moonlight against furniture. She turned over, forcing herself back into sleep, unaware that this moment would mark the last time she sensed her son in the house. By 11 p.m., the home had quieted entirely. Kevin's room smelled faintly of warm books, pencil shavings, and the desert air wafting through the slightly open window. Rusty curled at the foot of the stairs, the house otherwise silent, carrying only the ordinary creaks and whispers of settling wood. Outside, the streets glimmered faintly under streetlights, shadows stretching across cracked sidewalks. Morning came with disorienting abruptness. At 6:20 a.m., Kevin's mother discovered his empty room. The bed was neatly made, his belongings undisturbed, yet he was gone. Panic rose slowly, then accelerated as the house was combed from corner to corner. Rusty sniffed along the hallways, tail stiff, retracing familiar paths but alert to the absence of scent he had always known. The initial confusion evolved into frantic searching of the yard, the back alley, and nearby streets. Footsteps, faint at first, became purposeful calls and shouts as the reality set in. Kevin Freeman was missing. Neighbors were alerted. Doors opened in concern, and the first patrol car arrived within minutes, the siren cutting through the quiet morning. The house, once a haven, now felt hollowed out, every familiar sound amplified in the absence of the teenager who had once moved so predictably through it. Fear, disbelief, and growing dread filled the air, marking the beginning of a search that would stretch far beyond the physical boundaries of the home. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. When law enforcement arrived, the morning air in Sedona was crisp, carrying the scent of desert sage and damp earth from overnight dew. Sheriff Tom Callahan and Deputy Rivera moved methodically through the Freeman residence, their boots echoing faintly on the worn wooden floors. Every corner of Kevin's bedroom was catalogued, the neatly stacked textbooks, the small magnifying glass beside his bed, the backpack propped against the chair, all seemingly untouched. Windows were inspected, noting the slightly open side window facing the alley, the back door firmly closed but unlocked. The officers carefully recorded the scene, photographing each object, taking measurements, and cataloging anything that might provide a clue to the teenager's whereabouts. Kevin's mother recounted the half-remembered shadow at the bedroom doorway, her words tentative, unsure whether memory or dream had shaped the vision. The officers documented her account, eyes trained for any detail, but in the atmosphere of uncertainty, her observation was weighed cautiously. Outside, the sun climbed slowly, casting long red shadows across the property. The desert landscape, a stark, silent witness to the unfolding crisis. The community mobilized with remarkable speed. Neighbors grabbed flashlights, ropes, and binoculars, dogs barking along with the first K-9 units that joined the search. Volunteers fanned out across nearby fields, creeks, and narrow paths through the canyon. Each searcher followed careful instructions, moving in grids, calling Kevin's name, scanning the terrain for the faintest sign. The desert scrub, the red rocks, and the winding streets were combed with meticulous attention. Every stone and footprint scrutinized for anomalies. Near the Freeman property, small but significant evidence emerged. A worn leather compass, Kevin's own, was discovered partially hidden under a mesquite bush, its lanyard frayed in dirt street. Slight scuff marks traced from the side of the house toward the alley, suggesting hurried movement. Among these, a set of adult-sized footprints, distinct, deliberate, and larger than any family member, led away from the yard, pressed into softened earth and fading into the nearby path. Flattened grass indicated someone had paused, perhaps knelt, before moving onward. Each of these elements pointed away from voluntary departure, forming a chilling pattern that suggested abduction rather than disappearance. Photographs of the scene were taken with care. The evidence bagged and labeled, limited by the era's available technology. Digital photography had not yet fully permeated local precincts. So many images were on film, developed later, carefully stored for reference. Every photograph, note, and piece of evidence carried the weight of hope and fear in equal measure. As the search continued, the investigators huddled over maps and notes, comparing footprints, drag marks, and sightlines. The evidence told a consistent story. Kevin had not left of his own accord. The neighborhood, once seen as a safe enclave, suddenly felt porous and uncertain. Volunteers and law enforcement alike carried the tension of watching every shadow, listening for distant movement, and fearing what they might find. By the afternoon, Sheriff Callahan stood quietly at the edge of the yard, surveying the flattened grass and disturbed earth, the compass half buried nearby. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down, the realization settling that this was not a simple missing person case. Each mark, each trace, each carefully recorded object whispered of deliberate intrusion, of someone else's plan intersecting with the life of a boy who had trusted the familiar rhythms of home. The first day's search concluded with more questions than answers, and the unspoken dread lingered in the air, thick as the desert heat beginning to rise. Back at the sheriff's office, Sheriff Callahan and Deputy Rivera spread the evidence across a large table. Photographs, footprint casts, and the half-buried compass were examined repeatedly, compared to neighborhood maps and Kevin's known routines. The scattered clues painted a stark picture. This was not a runaway. The boy's disappearance had the hallmarks of abduction: methodical, confident, and alarmingly calm. The case was formally reclassified from a missing person to an abduction, elevating the urgency and drawing attention beyond local officers. Even though the resources remained limited by 2014 standards, a preliminary suspect list was compiled. The investigators considered anyone with access to the home or nearby routes, delivery personnel who visited regularly, repair workers with scheduled appointments, neighbors with knowledge of the property, and even adults known to Kevin through extracurricular activities. Among these, one man emerged as a prime suspect, someone who had been in the neighborhood on the night of Kevin's disappearance, whose presence near the property raised suspicion. He had no prior record, but a combination of timing and circumstantial details made him unavoidable in early interviews. Investigators worked carefully, reviewing his movements and statements, checking records for verification. The process revealed inconsistencies that drew attention, but ultimately, one critical piece of evidence exonerated him. A delivery log confirmed he had been elsewhere at the time, corroborated by a coworker and time-stamped surveillance from a distant business. The red herring cast tension over the investigation, showing both the diligence of the sheriff's office and the frustrating limits imposed by circumstantial suspicion. Meanwhile, the search expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Volunteers and officers combed the desert washes, canyon edges, and scrubland surrounding Sedona. State-level agencies reviewed the case, noting the calm, planned nature of the disappearance and the victim's intimate knowledge of local terrain. Despite extensive efforts, no additional physical evidence emerged, and no witnesses could identify vehicles or unfamiliar figures in the area. The lack of ransom, communication, or clear motive left the case eerily silent, each passing day deepening the mystery. After weeks of exhaustive searching and investigation, the case began to stall. Without new leads or physical proof, it was administratively designated as inactive, a cold case. The file, with every note, photograph, and collected item, was carefully boxed and stored in the department's archive. The label bore Kevin Freeman's name, the year 2014, and the notation "Abduction, Inactive." The emotional toll was palpable. Kevin's parents carried an unspoken grief, their home haunted by absence and unanswered questions. His sister wrestled with confusion and fear that would quietly persist into her own adulthood. The sheriff and deputy retained a quiet, gnawing sense of unfinished duty. The neighborhood, once familiar and reassuring, became a landscape imbued with lingering uncertainty, where every shadow could remind residents of a vanished boy who had once walked among them. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The box containing Kevin Freeman's file was placed on a high shelf in storage, dust gathering across its edges, the label fading slightly under fluorescent lights. Every document inside carried the weight of hope deferred, the silent promise that someday, perhaps, the story would be continued. Years passed like slow-moving clouds over Sedona, the red rocks witnessing the quiet evolution of both town and tragedy. Businesses opened and closed, streets saw new traffic patterns, and the neighborhood where Kevin Freeman had lived subtly shifted around the absence that had never been explained. The police department itself changed. New staff arrived. Computers replaced ledger books, and digital filing began to replace handwritten reports. Yet, amidst all this transformation, the box labeled Kevin Freeman, 2014, Abduction, remained on the top shelf of a metal cabinet, largely untouched. Dust settled across its surface, the corners slightly frayed from occasional handling during reorganizations. But it survived an unbroken link to a night that had frozen in time. The box itself nearly became a casualty of modernity. During a departmental digitization project, it was shuffled between storage rooms, narrowly avoiding disposal during a flood that seeped along the building's edge, and almost lost to a purge of old records deemed irrelevant. Its persistence was almost accidental, preserved by bureaucratic happenstance and the careful attention of a retired clerk who had remembered the significance of each envelope and photograph within. Within the box lay Kevin's life as it had been known, photographs of him hiking in the desert, the half-buried compass, footprint casts, witness notes, and meticulous sketches of the yard and neighborhood. Meanwhile, Kevin's family moved forward under the quiet weight of unresolved grief. His mother grew older, lines of worry etched across her face. Photographs of her son arranged carefully on mantels and in drawers, sometimes avoided, sometimes cherished. His father maintained a quiet routine, never abandoning hope entirely, but tempered by years of unanswerable questions. Kevin's sister entered adulthood carrying fragments of a childhood disrupted, her own milestones shadowed by his absence. Even the retired Sheriff Callahan reflected back on the case with a mixture of pride for the diligence applied and sorrow for the ultimate lack of resolution, the quiet memory of that pre-dawn shadow never leaving him. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to everyone, Kevin was living elsewhere under another name. His daily life existed parallel to the original family home, a carefully constructed reality in which he appeared to belong, but where fragments of another existence lingered at the edges of memory. Flashbacks of streets, smells, and faces intruded occasionally, inexplicable and haunting, leaving a sense of dislocation that he could never fully name. Teachers, employers, and neighbors noticed little, and systemic gaps in record-keeping, no centralized missing person databases. Limited interagency communication meant these anomalies went unreported and unexplored. Over the decades, Kevin's original file sat silently in storage, a testament to both persistence and neglect. Its survival became pivotal. Without it, the connection between past and present might have been lost entirely. The documents, photographs, and preserved evidence would eventually intersect with modern forensic technology, bridging the decades of absence and finally pulling a life from the shadows into clarity. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The box remained closed, the fluorescent lights flickering softly above it, an unassuming witness to a life paused and waiting. By 2021, Kevin Freeman, now 24 years old, lived under a different name in a small town miles from Sedona. He had been raised for years by someone connected to his abduction, attending local schools and working modest jobs. Yet his documents contained inconsistencies, birth certificates with conflicting dates, medical records with vague parental information, and school enrollments that never aligned perfectly. To outsiders, he appeared ordinary, blending seamlessly into a quiet routine. Yet beneath this exterior, Kevin carried a persistent sense of dislocation. Flashes of another home's sunlight through a bedroom window, the scent of pine and worn books. The soft padding of Rusty's paws intruded into his thoughts with no clear context. Like fragments of a life half remembered, his days were ordered but hollow. Work began early, chores completed with precision, and evenings spent alone in a small apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning products. He maintained hobbies that mirrored his past, studying rocks, walking the nearby trails, but always with a shadow of unease, a curiosity tinged with a longing for origins he could not name. Teachers and employers occasionally sensed that something about him was subtly off, an imperceptible unease. Yet the era's fragmented record systems left no avenues for investigation. Kevin was documented but invisible, living in plain sight under the guise of a manufactured identity. That the turning point came unexpectedly. Following the death of the abductor, whose estate required routine processing, Evan was asked to submit his fingerprints as part of inheritance verification. It was a mundane legal step, the kind millions of people undertake without thought. His prints, collected and digitized, were uploaded into the state database, a system now connected to national records in ways that had not existed in 2014. Within hours, the database automatically flagged a match. Fingerprints taken from the Freeman home during the original investigation now aligned precisely with those of the young man standing unaware at a clerk's office. Counter. The alert triggered an immediate review. Modern cold case investigators, armed with forensic databases, photographic records, and decades of preserved evidence, traced the match back to Kevin Freeman's 2014 abduction. The procedural bureaucracy collided with the physical traces left behind years earlier. The compass, the footprint casts, the drag marks, all suddenly contextualized in a new, unforgiving light. Kevin's ordinary life, carefully constructed over 7 years, was abruptly intersected by the past. He was contacted discreetly by law enforcement. The reality of the alert, explained in procedural terms, carried emotional weight that words could barely convey. Kevin felt a visceral dissonance, the shock of recognition, denial, and grief layered over the life he had known under a false identity. Memories, once fragmented and unexplainable, began to coalesce, bridging the gap between the boy who vanished and the young man who now confronted the truth. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? Meanwhile, a modern investigator retrieved the original case file from storage, brushing away dust from the box that had survived years of neglect, unaware that within its folders lay the evidence needed to reconnect a life fractured across time and identity. The intersection of modern technology, preserved evidence, and the persistence of bureaucratic systems had finally forced a confrontation between past and present, illuminating truths that had lain dormant for nearly a decade. Detective Laura Mendez, a specialist in cold cases with a reputation for patience and methodical precision, was assigned to Kevin Freeman's reopened file. Her office was quiet, lit by the soft hum of computers and the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights overhead. Stacks of photographs, maps, and evidence bags from 2014 were carefully arranged on her desk. Mendez approached the case like a puzzle, each item a fragment of a story paused in time. Waiting for modern tools to give it coherence, she began by reviewing the original evidence: the half-buried compass, adult-sized footprint casts, drag marks near the Freeman property, and photographs of Kevin's room. The details were painstakingly compared against digitized maps of the area, satellite imagery, and historical records of property ownership. Soil samples collected from footprints were sent to a modern lab, capable of analyzing mineral content and environmental signatures, connecting traces of dirt to nearby canyon locations known to be frequented by the abductor years earlier. Fibers from Kevin's backpack were examined using advanced microscopy, confirming they matched textiles found in residences tied to the adult who had concealed him. Shoe tread patterns were cross-referenced against historical databases, revealing a specific model popular among trade workers, narrowing down the suspect's occupation and movements. Utility records, tax filings, and tenant documents were cross-checked with the abductor's known residences. Every gap in his historical timeline was scrutinized, mapped against Kevin's disappearance window. Patterns emerged. The abductor had consistent presence near key locations, precise timing that allowed for concealment, and a calculated familiarity with both the neighborhood and Kevin's routines. The merged timeline painted a chilling picture of opportunity and intent. Detective Mendez noted the abductor's methodical behavior, the calm with which Kevin had been taken, and the years of carefully maintained concealment. Evidence that had once been disjointed, the compass, footprints, and drag marks, now converged into a cohesive narrative supported by modern forensics. The case file, once dormant and boxed, became a living document, each piece verified and contextualized. Finally, administrative records, coupled with forensic findings, identified a single adult as the likely perpetrator. The individual was deceased by the time of the match, but enough documentation existed to officially name them as the primary offender. Work histories, residences, and documented movements aligned convincingly with the circumstances of Kevin's abduction. The case, once stalled and silent, had a defined trajectory, giving law enforcement the clarity to approach Kevin with the truth about his identity. Detective Mendez prepared the briefing carefully. She knew the revelation would be life-altering. Kevin Freeman, long presumed lost, had survived under a false identity, and the person responsible had finally been identified in the historical record. The meticulous reconstruction bridged 7 years of absence, transforming fragments of evidence into a narrative of clarity, while leaving room for the emotional complexity that the victim would now confront. When Kevin Freeman was finally informed of the match, the initial disbelief was visceral. Sitting in a softly lit room, the details were presented with care. His fingerprints and DNA matched the traces collected from the Freeman home 7 years earlier. Kevin's heart raced as fragmented memory shadows in his bedroom. The smell of pine and books, the warmth of family laughter intertwined with his life under a false identity. Shock gave way to a cascade of emotions: grief for the years stolen, relief that survival was confirmed, and a lingering sense of disorientation about who he had been versus who he had become. Law enforcement quickly arranged DNA testing with his surviving biological relatives. Blood samples confirmed what the database had suggested. Kevin was indeed the long-missing boy of Sedona. The results were conclusive, scientifically undeniable. Each comparison of markers drew connections across time, bridging the divide of years, identities, and absence. The reunion was cautious, yet profoundly human. His mother, older but still carrying the warmth of unbroken love, reached out first. The embrace was tentative at first, the recognition of small details, the tilt of his head, the curve of his smile, the cadence of his voice confirming the bond that had never truly been severed. His sister studied him silently, searching for the boy she had known, seeing instead a young man shaped by experiences she could scarcely imagine. Shared gestures, private phrases, and memories long locked in photographs emerged naturally, creating a tentative bridge between two lifetimes. The psychological complexity was immense. Kevin had lived years under a false identity, forming habits, memories, and relationships that were real yet constructed. Integrating this life with the one lost to abduction required emotional negotiation. The stolen years weighed heavily. The false identity's attachments conflicted with the re-established family ties. Loved ones experienced relief mingled with grief. Joy tempered by recognition of the time that could never be reclaimed. Investigator Laura Mendez documented the emotional and forensic conclusions meticulously, marking the file as resolved in terms of identification and offender connection. Yet she understood that personal healing would extend far beyond the administrative closure. The reunion, though joyous, was also sobering, emphasizing the fragility of trust, the endurance of familial bonds, and the resilience required to reconcile a life interrupted. Kevin Freeman now faced the challenge of bridging the gap between two identities. The boy who vanished from Sedona and the young man who had navigated life under a constructed name. Every interaction carried the weight of history. Every conversation with family, a negotiation of memory, recognition, and rebuilding. The cold case resolution had returned his name, his history, and his rightful place within a family that had never ceased to hope. But the emotional reconciliation of 7 lost years would unfold slowly, like sediment layers revealing themselves only with time. With Kevin Freeman's identity confirmed and the abductor officially named in records, the case reached formal closure. The historical incident was reclassified as an abduction, consistent with 2014 terminology, and the primary offender was documented. Their life and movements analyzed to understand, as far as possible, how the abduction had been carried out with calculated precision. While the abductor was deceased, the official designation provided legal and procedural acknowledgement of the crime, restoring Kevin's identity in the public record and offering a measure of justice long delayed. Yet, many questions remained unanswered. Motives could only be inferred from behavioral patterns and circumstantial evidence. The precise reasoning behind the abduction would never be fully known. Investigators reflected on the possibilities of earlier intervention, recognizing that, even with diligence, the gaps in systems and technology at the time had made detection nearly impossible. The case served as a somber reminder that opportunity, secrecy, and the careful manipulation of trust could subvert even the most earnest local investigation. The resolution also offered systemic lessons. The survival of Kevin's file highlighted the critical importance of careful evidence retention, meticulous documentation, and the role of modern cross-jurisdictional databases. The case illustrated how early witness accounts, though initially doubted, could gain significance when preserved, emphasizing the need for law enforcement to listen carefully, even when evidence appears ambiguous. Biometric and DNA technologies, combined with patient archival practices, proved transformative, demonstrating how modern systems could correct decades-old wrongs. Emotionally, the story reinforced the resilience of both victims and families. Kevin's restoration to his biological family, though bittersweet, represented a profound victory of truth over time. The reconciliation of 2 lives, the boy stolen and the man grown, illustrated the enduring consequences of crime, the human cost of unresolved trauma, and the capacity for healing, even when delayed. Relief, grief, anger, and gratitude intertwined as Kevin and his relatives confronted the reality of lost years, finding solace in recognition and connection that had survived despite years of absence. Ultimately, the case underscored the enduring power of dedication, technology, and human perseverance. It reminded communities, investigators, and policymakers alike that preserving evidence, documenting the voices of vulnerable witnesses, and maintaining vigilance across decades could alter lives, correct injustices, and return identities stolen to those who deserved them. Kevin Freeman's story, though shaped by loss, disappearance, and concealment, became a testament to the persistence of truth and the quiet, transformative impact of justice fulfilled. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.